Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the recent rebellion we saw against the Russian army and what it means for Vladimir Putin's image. We also talk about why the prices of tomatoes are skyrocketing right now. But first, we talk about the Uniform Civil Code. The idea that there should be one single law that should decide how personal matters like marriage, divorce, inheritance, or adoption are governed, regardless of someone's religion. While addressing a poll-bound rally on Tuesday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a pitch for a uniform civil code and spoke out against the opposition, who he said were misleading minority communities regarding it. In his speech, he said, quote, "Can a family function if there are two different sets of rules for people? Will that house run properly? Then how can a country run with two kinds of laws?"
कि यूनिफॉर्म सिविल कोड के नाम पर ऐसे लोगों को भड़काने का काम हो रहा है। आप मुझे बताइए, एक घर में परिवार के एक सदस्य के लिए एक कानून हो, परिवार के दूसरे सदस्य के लिए दूसरा कानून हो, तो क्या वो घर चल पाएगा क्या? कभी भी चल पाएगा क्या? फिर ऐसी दोहरी व्यवस्था से देश कैसे चल पाएगा? हमें याद रखना है.
In his speech, the Prime Minister pointed out that the Uniform Civil Code finds mention in the Constitution and that even the Supreme Court is in favor of it. Now, the Uniform Civil Code is said to be the last item on BJP's ideological agenda. And the RSS, the party's ideological parent, has been talking about it for years now. And what's important to note is that many in the minority have been critical of this idea because they fear that a single law for personal matters will be skewed in the favor of those in the majority. In this segment, we are joined by Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath, who writes on law for the paper, to talk about the UCC. Apurva, one of the things that the Prime Minister pointed out in his speech was that the idea of UCC even finds mention in the Constitution. Could you talk about in what context it is mentioned and why was it put there?
So, Article 44 of the Constitution, which is in Part 4 and talks about directive principles of state policy. These are a set of guidelines for the state which are to be followed, but they are not really enforceable. For example, fundamental rights. I have a right to free speech. And if my free speech is violated, I can go to the court and seek remedy. The state is bound to protect my fundamental right to free speech. A directive principle of state policy, on the other hand, is like a right which cannot be enforced, which means that the state should strive to provide a common civil code, but I cannot go to the court and compel the state to do it now in my instance. And that's essentially the difference. Here is where some contentious things find mention. For example, cow slaughter. For example, a uniform civil code. So one of the directive principles of state policy is that the state in particular should strive to direct its policy for this aspect. And the framers of the Constitution felt that eventually India should move towards having a uniform civil code.
And to help people understand what this concept really is, could you give an example of how a uniform civil code could affect an aspect of our personal lives?
Right. So let's take the case of the majority. Hindus enjoy distinct economic benefit in the form of benefits given to Hindu undivided family. A Hindu undivided family that is incorporated has its own privileges and rights, and which people of other communities do not have. So that could be a contentious issue, whether one religious community can enjoy that benefit while people similarly placed in another religion may not. And then let's take the case of the minority. One big example that I can think of is what played out in the 80s when the Supreme Court delivered a judgment in the Shah Bano case. So in this case, the court basically upheld the right of a Muslim woman to seek alimony after divorce. But this is a concept that Muslim personal law, the Shariat code, does not recognize. So given the political fallout, the Rajiv Gandhi government then came in with an amendment to undo the judgment. Suppose we have uniform laws on divorce. Muslim women, like Hindu women, could go to court to seek alimony from their divorced husbands.
Right, and the other thing that we heard PM Modi mention in his speech was that the Supreme Court has been in favor of UCC. Could you tell us what the court has said about it in the past?
Right. In 1985, from the Shah Bano ruling that we're talking about, there are a plethora of judgments in which the court has said that the solution to these complex personal laws that we navigate every day and its fallout is really to have a uniform civil code. We've heard the court say this as recently as 2017 when it was invalidating triple talaq. So there have been several judgments where the court has said that the government must look towards keeping its promise in the directive principles of state policy.
And uniform civil code is something that has been on the RSS and the BJP's mind for some time now. And the fear among many is that if a single law is passed to govern personal matters like marriage and inheritance, then it will be used to target those in the minority. Could you speak to those concerns?
So, first of all, Shashank, we don't know if it will be a single law that will replace this whole gamut of personal laws that we have. And that essentially is the problem statement. We don't know the form or shape that a uniform civil code could take. There are about 200 tribes in the Northeast which have its own distinct customs and traditions. And on personal issues such as marriage, inheritance, divorce, they are all governed in their own distinct ways. So will one law replace all of those? Or will it give people a choice to choose between a uniform secular code versus their own religious code, which we already have? That is the Special Marriage Act and the Indian Succession Act. So right now a citizen has an option to choose between a secular code versus their own religious personal laws. So will the UCC be a framework that will build on this secular law? Or will it leave a citizen with no option if they want to follow religious law, right? These are all questions that we don't have the answers to. We talk about a uniform civil code, but we really don't know what shape and form a uniform civil code could be like.
Okay, so if the government is planning to go ahead with this, what do you think it should keep in mind while doing so?
A big point of conversation that we've seen play out since 2017 when the conversation started around triple talaq is that Muslim personal law originates from the Holy Book itself. The Shariat law has religious significance, and there is a section which believes that that cannot be tinkered with, that a law that has been applied consistently for thousands of years cannot be changed, but it has happened in several Islamic countries as well. For example, Turkey, Bangladesh, they have progressive laws compared to what we have in our personal law that we follow in India when it comes to Muslims. So that will be a big point of contention on how the Shariat will continue to work within the framework or outside the framework of a uniform civil code. The other thing is that the Constitution also guarantees certain rights to citizens, which is to protect their own diversity, especially with tribal communities. So a uniform code which would reflect the ethos of the majority might sort of be overridden or not find place when it comes to these small communities which seek to protect its own culture and tradition. One example which has been the discourse on Twitter also for the last couple of days is that several South Indian communities, there are cousins who marry. That is not a prohibited relationship when it comes to marriage in several communities. Parts of Maharashtra, Andhra, Karnataka, this is very common. But in other parts of the country, this idea is not at all in public consciousness. So these are issues that a country as diverse as India will have to navigate.
And is there a concern that a law like this could tinker too much into the personal lives of people?
So laws that regulate really personal aspects of our life, they are there in place and they already regulate these aspects. Who you can adopt, who you can marry, when you can marry, and what are the consequences of marriage. These are all issues governed by law. So which law that is really that question now. Whether that should continue to be a religious law or whether everybody should have the same law is the question. The same-sex marriage case in the Supreme Court, for example, which was live on YouTube and was widely watched by everybody. One of the arguments that the petitioners made is fundamentally this, that there should be a uniform law irrespective of gender that can be followed when it comes to these aspects of marriage, succession, inheritance, divorce, and these aspects. So the question really becomes that when we are talking about a law that cuts across genders, why can't we have a law that cuts across religious lines?
And next we talk about Russia, which has been in the news for the past few days Not only because of the war it's been waging against Ukraine, but also because over the last weekend, it witnessed an armed rebellion that shocked the world. This rebellion, which ended on Saturday, was seen by many as the single biggest threat to President Vladimir Putin yet, and was conducted by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who owes a lot of his success to Putin, and is the leader of a private military company called the Wagner Group. To understand what happened, we spoke to Nandan Unnikrishnan, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And he explained what happened over the weekend.
What you saw was that prior to the weekend, the head of the Wagner Group, he issued a few sort of statements which were very harsh on the Minister of Defense as well as his Chief of Staff, virtually calling for their heads, saying that Russia was executing the war in Ukraine badly and that urgently some corrections were needed.
Now, at the time, the Wagner Group had been deployed in Ukraine. But he says that on Saturday, we found out that the group had come back into Russia and had taken over the city of Rostov-on-Don,
which is the military headquarters of the Southern Command, which was in charge of the military operations in Ukraine. Having taken over this township as well as the headquarters, he conducted sort of preliminary negotiations with some of the officers there, and with them not conceding to his demands, he decided that he was going to embark on a march to Moscow, or rather what he called a march for justice.
The group eventually managed to cross 700 to 800 kilometers within just 12 hours. But then 200 kilometers away from Moscow, there was a dramatic intervention which involved the longtime ally of Putin, the Belarusian president Alexander Lukashenko,
who acted as a post office, and some kind of deal was hammered out between Prigozhin and the Russian authorities, after which Prigozhin pulled back the Wagner outfit. So the soldiers returned to their barracks in Ukraine, while the chief was supposed to go off to Belarus, that is Mr. Prigozhin. In return for that, the Russian state would not pursue the criminal case on treason for insurrection that it had instituted against Prigozhin and some of his entourage. And also all the other members of Wagner would be allowed to either go back home without any cases, or if they so desired, they could sign up separate contracts with the Ministry of Defense. So that, in a nutshell, were the events that took place over the weekend.
Now, talking about the man at the center of this rebellion, Unnikrishnan says that Prigozhin was born in the Soviet times, and before the USSR collapsed, had already spent 8 years in jail. He later started selling hot dogs and eventually started his own restaurants as well.
As luck would have it, these restaurants, one of the restaurants at least, was occasionally dropped into by a gentleman called Mr. Vladimir Putin, who happened to at that point be one of the assistants to the mayor of the city, Mr. Anatoly Sobchak.
Later, as Putin rose in ranks and eventually became the president, he says that Prigozhin made use of his contacts and got hold of some lucrative deals.
But in 2014, he saw an opportunity when the seizure of Crimea took place. He saw the opportunity and he started what was called, in Russian, it translates into a private military company, PMC as it were.
This, of course, was the Wagner Group, which actually started its work in Syria in 2015 and was part of the troops deployed there by the Russian side. Nandan says that this group later also went on to provide security services to some African nations.
So he developed an outfit which had varied experience, acquired that experience, became a fighting force. And then, of course, in 2022, Ukraine called and he was deployed there as part of the forces that the Russians had. And there, of course, undoubtedly, they earned plaudits for the way the Wagner Group fought in Bakhmut and Soledar, and how they captured those two townships despite heavy losses, despite ferocious resistance. And they were hailed as heroes by the Russian leadership as well as the Russian people. I mean, there was no doubt about it, because even President Putin, when he was congratulating the armed forces with the victory in Bakhmut, he specifically outlined the role, mentioned the Wagner Group and their contribution.
Okay, so at a time when his role in the war was being appreciated, and considering that he's close to Putin, what made him launch this rebellion?
I don't think he launched a rebellion or mutiny or coup in the classic sense. He had a long-standing feud with the defense ministry, which if you look back also, you'll find even 6-8 months ago, he raved about the lack of ammunition, that they were not giving him weaponry, and that Russia would lose if he was not supplied all that he needed. What really sort of irked him most was that the defense ministry, with the support of the government, that includes Mr. Putin, moved to effectively disband Wagner by requiring all private military companies to sign up specific contracts with the defense ministry and then function under the orders of the defense ministry. So he was opposing that. In fact, he's put out a video statement today in which he acknowledges that the trigger for his actions was the imminent disbandment of Wagner, which was to occur on 1st of July 2023. His argument is that Wagner was performing a very useful role, and therefore it had turned out to develop into one of the finest fighting forces in the world, and it would be a mistake to disband it. And it was in the interest of Russia to keep Wagner as this excellent fighting force.
But he says that Prigozhin's pleas were not heard, and which is why he decided to march to Moscow. And now, even though many spectators might have seen this as a big threat to Putin, Unnikrishnan says that no one in Russia probably thought that.
Because if you looked at whatever was available on footage in Russian television channels, at least, life was going on as normal. I mean, if you call up, let's say, even Indian embassy officials in Moscow, they would tell you that everyone was going about their business as normal. Of course, they were glued to television. They were watching this entire adventure, as it were. But no one felt threatened or felt that there was an imminent coup or government fall that was anticipated. I personally think that the Russian government did not nip this in the bud, in the sense take on the Wagner Group in Rostov-on-Don itself, because Mr. Putin clearly wanted to avoid bloodshed. And Wagner Group had just come with huge experience out of Bakhmut of fighting urban warfare. And so if the firefight broke out in Rostov-on-Don, which is a 1 million strong city, it would have been a bloodbath. So I think Putin was hoping that, let him come towards Moscow, but on the way, when he sees the kind of forces, the power of the Russian state, that maybe something will happen. But the problem that occurred, I suspect, on the way was Prigozhin was not being reached out to by Putin himself. You see, it was all kinds of secondary people who were reaching out to him until eventually, I suppose, Putin or somebody in his entourage suggested that maybe the Belarus president could speak to Prigozhin. Both of them have been friends for a long time. I don't know if they're friends, but they at least know each other for many years. So the Belarus president had sort of a measure of success in the sense that he was able to talk to Prigozhin and negotiate these terms where he effectively surrendered.
And now, after this rebellion and the way it was handled, how do you think it has affected Putin's image?
Well, outside Russia, Putin's image has undoubtedly taken a beating. Yeah, because instability in an authoritarian country is almost like doomsday event, that kind of thing. Within Russia, it is a bit too early to make a credible assessment, I would say. Right now, his reputation may have a bit of a bounce, or go up a little bit, because he will be undoubtedly viewed as someone who was able to muster enough resources to resolve such a complicated situation without a bloodbath, without shedding blood, as it were. But subsequently, I suppose people will be asking questions and thinking about how did this situation arise in any case, and why was it allowed to fester? If the man had been raving and ranting for so long, why was it not dealt with before? But I think the situation is even a little bit more complicated than that, because what I understand is that Prigozhin met Putin about 10 days before he launched on this action. And both sides said they had a productive meeting. So presumably the Russian leadership was completely unprepared, including their intelligence agencies, were completely unprepared for Mr. Prigozhin going off the edge and launching this kind of a march for justice, taking over a township and all.
And do we know what will happen to the Wagner Group now? Will it still be involved in the Ukraine war?
Well, actually, there I'm a little confused myself because I would have originally thought that the Wagner Group would be disbanded because, after all, it is a private company owned by Mr. Prigozhin and maybe some other of his partners. But then I realized that also the Wagner Group has a serious commitments in Africa, where it is in contract with governments of Mali, a Central African Republic, for provision of certain kind of security services as well as for training their forces. So these are not contracts that the Russian state would be happy to renege on. So I don't know how they can do this by disbanding Wagner. They'll have to keep it alive, maybe under a different leadership or something. Maybe Mr. Prigozhin can be persuaded to sell his share of whatever he owns in Wagner, somebody who's more acceptable to the Russian state. I mean, I don't know what the final solution will be, but it's clear that the Russian state does not want to give up on the involvement of Wagner in Africa. So some way will be found forward. But as far as Wagner is concerned vis-a-vis Ukraine, the individuals of Wagner who sign up defense ministry contracts will find action in Ukraine. But Wagner as an entity, I doubt will have any further action in Ukraine.
And in the end, we talk about tomatoes. In the last 2 weeks, tomato prices have shot up drastically across the country. 1 kg of tomatoes is selling for more than 60 rupees right now, and in some markets for almost 100 rupees. And what's more worrying is the fact that farmers and traders think that the prices won't be stabilizing anytime soon. To understand the reason behind the sudden increase in prices, my colleague Utsa Sarmin speaks to Indian Express's Parthasarthi Biswas.
So Partha, can you first tell us why we are seeing such an increase in tomato prices right now?
So before we understand why the prices have gone up, say towards the end of June, let us go back a bit in time and look at tomato prices from the start of this year. Now from Jan, Feb, March, April, May, the tomato prices have been muted, and in certain cases it has gone down drastically. So what happened is that this year the summer has been exceptionally high and the winter was almost absent. So towards the beginning of the year, Jan, Feb, we did not experience the chill that is necessary, and March onwards the temperature were exceptionally high, because of which the tomato plants and the tomato farms were attacked by 2 different kind of viruses in various parts of the country. And also the prices were pretty down. The prices were down because most of the farmers resorting to what we call as the panic sell. When they saw their produce was being attacked, whatever produce they had, instead of staggering off the picking, they picked most of the market ready or the almost ready tomatoes and brought to the market. And that this tomato started flooding the markets March onwards. March, April, May, and till the first week of June, prices almost collapsed.
Right, and in many places the prices for tomatoes went as low as 2 rupees per kg, right? As opposed to 10 or 15 rupees per kg.
Yes, that's true. So when the prices hit 2 rupees a kg, 2 things happened. Farmers who had their plantations ready for picking, they just did not do anything for the sustenance of the plants. They just abandoned the fields. They did not tend to it. They did not, give the inputs necessary. So now there is a huge supply crunch. That's why the prices have gone up.
Okay, and Partha, you mentioned that the winter crop was abandoned by the farmers after the prices fell, and now it's time to sow the summer, the kharif crop. But it's not like we will get tomatoes as soon as the farmers plant the crop, right? So considering this, will we see the situation getting better anytime soon?
Oh no. As you correctly pointed out, everything in agriculture has a time lag. So it is not like you switch on and then the production line starts. So as of now, the kharif plantations also have not started. The kharif plantation depends on rain, and as you know, the monsoon has been plain truant throughout the country. It's only in the last few days that we have seen good rains. Once the rains reach to, say, an optimum level, the farmers will start their plantation work, and that produce will come after 3 months. We are now in the last week of June. So even if they take it up now, June, July, August, September, the first produce of this will come towards the end of August. There is nothing we can do to speeden up this, and we will have to see. There will be a supply crunch in the domestic market for at least 1 or 2 months more.
Right, and Partha, in a situation like this where prices have gone up drastically and the supply is low, do we usually see any kind of government interventions?
If it was onion, they would have floated tenders for global imports of onions. And as of I know, they have not ever imported tomatoes. We do export a bit of tomato to Dubai, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but we have never imported much as far as I know. You see, tomato is one of the top 3 crops the government has decided to work on, that is TOP, tomato, onion and potato. But work in terms of tomato would require investment in value chain, investment in new varieties and other things, but not much work has happened on ground. And if you remember, in 2014-15, the same thing had happened when, because of drought and other reasons, tomato production went down. But that time, the hue and cry started only when the retail prices shot up close to 100. Same thing might happen. So it's like, history revisits us at every 3 to 4 years, but we don't learn any lessons from it. As soon as the prices started dipping, there might have been some contingency plan made, like, government intervention to ensure the prices remain stable and farmers do not abandon their crop. But if that would have happened, maybe we wouldn't have seen the retail prices shooting up above 60 in every market possible. And now, with no really immediate help in sight, the prices will remain high. And once again, it proves that we did not learn anything from history.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, with help from Utsa, Sarmin, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.